Everybody, and welcome to Saturday the 9th of May and this special Saturday live stream from me. I'm Bronwyn Pearson from Pinnacle People Solutions, and we provide HR advice and services and support to regionally based small to medium enterprises and not-for-profit organisations. And we are here to help you through this COVID-19, what should we call it, dilemma? Unprecedented times, definitely. So we are here to help you and your business through these really challenging COVID-19 times. So we have been live, and we continue to be live at 9:15 every weekday with updates on new information and more detailed information about topics related to staffing and business management during this process. Good morning to those of you who are joining us. Really appreciate you logging on this morning. So the reason we're doing this Saturday live stream special is we're particularly going to be focused this morning on the announcements that have been made in the last 24 hours by the federal government to do with the national framework for easing restrictions to do with COVID. So I'd ask you to feel free to ask any questions that you have as we go along. I can see the chat screen here. I'll do my best to answer them as you ask them, but otherwise you can contact us by anytime by Facebook on private messenger, email or telephone. Good morning, Belinda and Ingrid. Certainly what we would expect to normally you would, if for the daily Facebook live streams, my team would be up here giving you contact details and links and so forth. They are having a well-earned weekend. And so what I would encourage you to do to find our contact details is to go onto our website. So that is just www.pinnaclepeoplesolutions, all lowercase, all one word, .com.au. So feel free to do that. So this morning we wanted to get into the news sort of breaking that happened yesterday afternoon via the Prime Minister and the National Chief Medical Officer about the much anticipated national framework for easing restrictions and what that means for employers and their employees. So what we do know, of course, because we're all living through this at the moment, is that we've spent nearly 2 months, some more than 2 months, enduring some form of coronavirus lockdown. So it's been a struggle, and businesses have had to pivot, change, close, partially reopen, adapt, and all of those things. And our not-for-profit colleagues have seen not only challenges to the way they deliver services, but an increase to demand for those services. I have to say, it's somewhat ironic to me that that the government at all levels have prioritised homelessness and the need to provide meaningful housing and safe housing for those that are homeless at this time because of fear of the contribution of spread of COVID-19. It's a bit scary that it takes a pandemic for us to focus on that, but I've recently read the good news that Tamworth Family Support Service and also Homes North, in collaboration, have managed to actually find all those who were seeking accommodation who are homeless in Tamworth, the Tamworth area, ongoing support and accommodation. So thank you so much to you guys for that effort. That's huge. So the press conference that we had yesterday by the Prime Minister and the Chief Health Officer have outlined to date the biggest mass relaxation of restrictions since the outbreak began. The steps are broken down into a 3-step roadmap, and I'm going to take you through what that looks like. The intention is that 3-step roadmap will be rolled out between now, so May and July. But with always with the caveat that the premiers and chief ministers will be adopting step 1 of the plans in the days ahead, but they are entirely in control of to what pace and the nature of the rollout of that over time. So this is an indicative 3-step roadmap, but the timing of it is going to be entirely up to each individual state and territory. So let's have a look then at breaking down Friday's announcements. And I have just noticed that our Pinnacle People Solutions Facebook page and the particular supports that we've got in there for COVID-19 have actually been sneakily put up in the chat screen by somebody from the team. So somebody's doing a sneaky, but thank you, whoever's doing the sneaky. I'll chat with you later. Bless. So let's break down yesterday's announcements. But please bear in mind that all of them are going to be individually determined at the state and territory level, and all of them need to be legislated before they're effective at each of those state and territory levels. So some jurisdictions are going to move faster than others, and I'll give a bit of an overview as to what some of the states have already announced in a moment. But this roadmap to a COVID-safe Australia is actually available up on the federal government website. If you just search in Google for roadmap to a COVID-safe Australia, and it's going to come up for you. In the first stage, which each of the territories and states are announcing when this will start to apply in their particular states and territories, you will be allowed to have 5 visitors in your home. So a couple of weeks ago, we had that increase from 1 in certain circumstances to 2. That's now going to be 5. So that's your household, the members of your household, plus 5 guests. And again, this is subject to these being rolled out in the relevant states and territories. And I'll cover off what that looks like in a moment. Certainly, there's to be no change in New South Wales for the coming week. Certainly, our Premier has made that clear, but we'll get into that in a moment. And in terms of being outdoors, you can actually be in a group of 10. So that's yourself and 9 other people. Now, some states have this gathering rule already in place, but this recommendation will be extended to all jurisdictions still living under the stricter 2-person restrictions, which includes those of us in New South Wales. So one of the questions that came up, not surprisingly, and I have to say my son was delighted with the answer to this question. So does it mean you're allowed to go and kick the footy around with 9 mates? And when the authorities were asked this question yesterday directly, the answer was yes. So there's going to be some very happy people, of course, with appropriate social distancing and hygiene measures in place. So that will be the interpretation of the 10 people outside, yourself and 9 others, will be 10 people training in a football field, 10 people getting together in a park. Outdoor boot camps can start back up again with social distancing in place. And playgrounds, public swimming pools, libraries, community centres and golf courses can reopen. Of course, in New South Wales, I think we've seen that already with golf courses being allowed to reopen, but for the purposes of the nationwide guidelines, that's going to be happening. For indoor gatherings, the Prime Minister has clarified that step 1 would be 5 guests in your own home, so your household members plus 5 guests. In terms of cafes and restaurants, they can also reopen. So those are seated venues. So seated venues that serve food, so cafes and restaurants can reopen, but they can only have 10 customers sitting at tables at any one time, and they have to, if you've got seated people then in a restaurant or a venue, then you need to have the 4 metre square rule applying. So venues with no seated dining, so bars, nightclubs or casinos, will not be allowed to open until step 3. So this is only cafes and restaurants that have seated venues. So only 10 customers sitting at tables at any one time, and the minimum of the 4 metre squared rule. If there isn't seating and you're still doing takeaway, it's the 1.5 metre social distancing. So food service venues, as I said, must ensure there's a space of 4 metres square per person, and each patron exercises social distancing of 1.5 metres. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat screen here to see if I've got any questions yet. This 10-person rule also applies to retail businesses. So just to put that in perspective, one of the things I've had a business owner ask me overnight is, okay, so if I have different parts of my business in different physical locations, does that mean I can have 10 people in each location? And what do we do if you've got a location that is shared by more than one business? Very good questions. On the first question, I would imagine that it will mean 10 people in any particular closed area that constitutes a service or a good or service delivery. Where you share a physical space with another business, we'll need to get clarification as to whether you would have to share the 10-person situation or whether you could have 10 in each designated business area. So please watch this space. We'll get back to you about that. Funerals and weddings can also be a bit bigger. So the 10-person rule at funerals has been extended to 30 people if the service is outdoors. For weddings, you can have up to 10 people in attendance. Queensland have clarified that if you have an indoor funeral, you can have 20 mourners. If it's an outdoor funeral, it would be 30, which is what the national framework for stage 1 is suggesting. So what about changes to workplaces? So in steps 1 and 2, the plan still is that Australians should continue to work at home if it works for you and your employer. So that is certainly still on the agenda as the main form of working for workplaces in steps 1 and 2 of this 3-stage return. It's not until step 3 when a physical return to workplaces is contemplated. So this is outside, of course, of cafes, restaurants, retail businesses, etc. This is otherwise workplaces. And one of the things that we have seen during this pandemic to this point in time, and will absolutely have to see moving forward, and I'm going to talk a bit more in a moment about the beware elements for business owners at this point in time, and that is that this stiff upper lip thing that Australians sometimes have around and soldier on mindset around when they're sick, coming to work when they're sick, has to stop. So we've seen a much greater vigilance around that in terms of businesses during COVID, of course, but this is going to have to continue to be a no-go zone. So no more heroics coming to work with a cough or a cold or a sore throat or any kind of symptoms. And that's going to have to be off the agenda for the foreseeable future. So let's hope we don't see a return to, oh, well, I'm just a little bit under the weather, I'll go to work. All of us have been guilty of that. I know I have. I'm sure any of us watching this morning will be able to kind of go, yes, well, that's kind of been me. But we're all going to have to change that mentality in every workplace, not just workplaces where we might know that we would have people particularly vulnerable. Interestingly, as a little digression, Woolworths released some statistics yesterday as well, and they've had a 40% reduction in the purchase of cold and flu medications. How fascinating. And that would clearly be because people are following the restrictions and staying self-isolated, and the transmission of normal colds and flu are significantly reduced at the moment. So anyway, that's a good thing. So what's the status in respect of travel? And for all of us, all of you joining us from regional areas this morning, pay particular attention to this because this impacts us. So step 1 of the roadmap allows recreational travel for day trips of up to 150 kilometres is what the Prime Minister has said. So I'm our head office of our business and my home is based in Armidale. I have been making work trips to Tamworth as necessary. We've got a lot of clients in the northwest over this period of time, but they've been very restricted. Now, once the State Premier says that New South Wales can adopt this step 1 framework, it means that I'll be able to go to Tamworth and beyond for recreational purposes, not just for work, which will be fantastic. This is still likely to be within your specific state or territory. So for most of us who are tuning in for New South Wales, unless you're bordering on another region and you have a permit or otherwise okay to cross borders. So the Prime Minister has flagged that step 2 could involve some interstate travel, but interestingly, airlines like Qantas have actually drastically reduced back any domestic travel until the 30th of June and cancelled a whole range of flights before then. So I can't imagine that there'd be a huge amount of interstate travel happening in stage 2, but it's a possibility. The idea about stages 2 and 3 is that we would look at seeing gradual travel increases to distances and the number of businesses open in time for the June school holidays. So that's what the Prime Minister is looking at. It's only at step 3 that authorities will consider trans-Tasman travel between Australia and New Zealand. Just a quick note that unfortunately there's been some apparent fraud detected on the government's early access to super scheme, and so that means that access to that scheme has been frozen since yesterday while the ATO have a look at those allegations of apparently identity fraud. So we'll keep you informed about that. So step 1 we're pretty clear about. Steps 2 and 3. The separation of the restrictions into 3 steps means that each step can be assessed before the next one's implemented. And as they're implemented will be entirely up to each individual state and territory. So the idea about that is so that authorities can check that there are no unacceptable outbreaks before moving on to the next step. Having said that, what we can expect is that there will be an increase in cases. The whole idea about releasing these restrictions is that our health facilities are now able to cope, it's considered able to cope with the consequences of releasing the restrictions. So I'm going to talk in a moment about the health and safety obligations that employers have and are going to continue to have, and the focus that the government and the National Cabinet have actually put on this, because your liability as business owners is only going to increase as these restrictions ease. So we'll get into that in a moment. The Prime Minister has said that each restriction would be reviewed by National Cabinet 3 weeks after it was implemented, and I imagine that's going to have to be a staged review because some states and territories will go earlier with each stage than others will. So that obviously we'll have to look at that in a sort of a staged way. And the Prime Minister's described those stage reviews as not formal reviews. They'll be more like stock takes as to where the framework is at, and looking at where all the states are and how they're going to move towards an ultimate aspiration of being at step 3 in July. Now, that's the ultimate aspiration, but whether we get there is going to rely on these stock takes and how things go. So step 2 broadly will include gatherings of up to 20 people in your home. And gyms, beauty salons, cinemas, galleries, amusement parks, caravan parks and camping grounds will reopen at step 2. That's the broad national framework plan. Step 3 will see increases of gatherings to 100, physical return to workplaces, nightclubs, food courts and saunas, etc. can open, and all interstate travel and potential international travel could be on the table. And as I said, the aspirational time for step 3 is July, but that will depend on how things go in the stocktake measures that are taken after steps 1 and steps 2, and also the fact that every state and territory is going to take their own timetable with these. So to do a quick recap, step 1 allows access to cafes and restaurants. Work from home is still for most workplaces is still the benchmark. If it suits you and your employer, you can have up to 5 visitors in your home. So whoever's in your household plus 5 visitors. You can have gatherings of up to 10 people outside are allowed. So yourself and 9 people. And yes, that can be kicking a footy around a footy field with some mates. Cafes and restaurants can open, those that have seated service, provided they meet social distancing requirements. So that's 4 metres squared for seated and only up to 10 people seated at one time. Libraries, community centres, playgrounds and boot camps can be open. Again, all of the same social distancing requirements will be in place. Weddings and religious gatherings, up to 10 people will be allowed. You can do more now than essential shopping. So you can actually go and shop where it's not just for medical supplies, pharmacy, groceries. You can go to a restaurant or cafe, but as long as they're operating according with the new rules. There can be home inspections and auctions will restart. You can visit local playgrounds. You can attend a boot camp in no numbers of no more than 10. And you can travel locally and regionally for non-essential reasons now. That's once in New South Wales, the Premier gives the go-ahead for that. Obviously, all of those things are going to be subject to social distancing and hand hygiene rules, and the restaurant and cafe openings are subject to the 1.5 metre distance between people, but the 4 square metre rule perimeter around those that are seated. Also, for gatherings, for weddings, funerals, or religious gatherings, they have to record the contact details of those involved. And obviously, there's still a very big push and emphasis on all of us downloading the COVID Safe app. I'm not making any recommendations to you as to whether or not you should, but please inform yourself and make an informed decision. Step 2, again, this is what is being anticipated in this 3-step process. Most businesses would be reopened with physical distancing and hand hygiene rules. Gatherings up to 20 people outside of your home, gatherings of 20 people in gyms, beauty salons, cinemas, theatres, amusement parks, galleries and museums. And some interstate travel is possible in step 2. And step 3, that would be when we're anticipating all Australians would be back at work with physical distancing and hygiene rules applying. Gatherings of up to 100. Cross Tasman and Pacific Island travel may be possible, and also so might international student travel. Gatherings of 100 people in food courts, saunas and bathhouses with respect to interstate travel, and pubs and clubs with some restrictions will be open is the anticipation in step 3. So when will step 1 when is that likely to be in effect? For South Australia, it's been announced that will be in effect from Monday. For Queensland, Saturday the 16th of May. For Victoria, there'll be an announcement by Premier Daniel Andrews given on Monday. Tasmania, some phases of step 1 from Monday, but the rest on the following Monday, the 18th. The Northern Territory, there's been no statement there in respect of that yet. In New South Wales, we've had a statement that there will be no further changes this week. So I anticipate that to be this coming week, so the week of the 11th of May. And the Premier has said that she would not be rushing to lift any more restrictions. And the next major changes to lockdown in life in New South Wales would likely be seen later this month, so later in May or by June. So it's quite possible that New South Wales, and we'll wait to see what happens with Victoria and the Northern Territory, but certainly in New South Wales, they're taking a very softly approach. So we may not see step 1 for at the very least another week, if not towards the end of this month or in June. So things to be aware of as a business owner and as staff. Certainly for business owners, make sure you're communicating regularly and often with your staff about what's happening. So we're obviously up here every weekday and this morning for a special edition to keep you as business owners and your staff up to date. It's really important that you take this information and you make sure your staff are really well informed about what's happening. In a vacuum of communication and information, people get ideas into their own heads. So it's much better for you to be controlling the narrative as the business owner, and it's also really good for morale that you're communicating regularly with your staff. I would strongly advise you to get advice on how to handle a staged return to work for stood down staff in particular. But also for staff that are currently continuing to work, but in different locations or in different modes. And this is whether you're JobKeeper eligible or not. You have very clear and stringent obligations. What we've also had reported in the last 24 hours from the Fair Work Ombudsman is that they are seeing a 40% increase in complaints compared to this time last year. And a lot of it is to do with JobKeeper and stand down directions and JobKeeper enabling directions and other directions that employers have given that may not be JobKeeper enabled or eligible, I should say. So it's incredibly important for you to be doing the right thing at this point and to know what that is. So please get advice before you start making further changes to how your workplace is going to reinvigorate or change operations. The other thing that is incredibly important for you to know at this point in time, and I'm going to do a couple of sessions this coming week on getting down into the detail of this, but you as employers can be held liable for workers who contract coronavirus on the job. And now the likelihood of that happening is going to increase as restrictions are eased and the virus potentially becomes more active. And the only reason that, as I said, we're looking at restrictions is to try and slowly reinvigorate the economy in line with the extent to which our health facilities can manage the consequences of that, which is going to be an increase in cases. So with that in mind, if you're going to be looking at changing, gradually staging return, those sorts of things with your work environment or changing your work practices as restrictions are eased, you need to be incredibly careful about that and be warned about making sure that you're adhering to health guidelines as restrictions ease and workers prepare to return to offices and other employment spaces. You need to make sure that you understand those health guidelines very, very clearly and that you stick to them religiously, because otherwise you can face quite serious legal trouble. Even in a pandemic, employers are obligated by law to provide a safe workplace. And if you ignore social distancing or hygiene guidelines, you could be sued by your staff who might suffer long-term impacts, even short-term impacts. You're certainly going to be open to workers' comp cases, which if your premium's over $30,000 a year is going to be premium impacting for you, any loss of time, but you can also be sued. So it's incredibly important, not only for a moral and ethical reason to be keeping your staff healthy and safe, but the lawful consequences could be quite significant for you. If you end up with workers that contract COVID as part of doing their job, it can and there can be, as we know from the publicity already, serious permanent consequences that can arise, sometimes not immediately. Sometimes those serious consequences present themselves down the track. And you, as the employer, have been negligent by not observing what are now readily accessible guidelines, then you could be subject to a common law claim from your staff member. And look, quite frankly, in the current climate, it would be very hard for an employer to say that they had no idea about the guidelines. In fact, it would be nigh on impossible. And we've seen the focus of the National Cabinet move to health and safety a few weeks ago when they introduced the 10 principles, which I've talked about in a previous live stream. But they're also, of course, Tuesday this week, they also named Safe Work Australia as the primary source of information. They've introduced toolkits for specific businesses, industries, professions, etc., on how to make sure to keep your workplace safe. And the unions are pushing for legal implications and penalties, etc., for employers that do not do that. So it's those new safety measures for businesses that have been announced by the federal government means that businesses that have been doing hot desking practices, have open plan offices, etc., need to change those. They need to put hand sanitizer throughout offices. They need to avoid shaking hands, replace physical meetings with video chats, and avoid large groups in small spaces. So this is going to continue to be ongoing for some time. And any of us as employers who are found to be negligent for health and safety will be held liable for damages, and negligence could include failing to provide hand sanitizer or ensuring social distancing measures are in place. So the litmus test for businesses is pretty serious and pretty high. Okay, so Anybody on your staff, particularly who might have pre-existing health conditions and contract the disease, are not prevented from making a workers' comp claim if they were not warned about the virus in the workplace. So this is where you're going to have to be incredibly vigilant. And of course, as with any of the other aspects of this to do with your staffing, we can provide advice and support to you over this period of time. So the message to take away from that is that as employers, we need to be vigilant and not ignore the guidelines as we start to return to business as normal over a period of time, and have a very clear plan, get advice, have a really clear plan, communicate regularly with your staff, make sure everybody's on board, understands exactly what can and cannot happen, and that you are vigilant about making sure that those things are happening in the workplace. Okay, I'm just having a look again at the chat screen. I haven't had any questions at this point in time, but if you do have any, you know how to get in touch with us. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this special live stream. We will be unpacking this in greater detail next week, and there's some publicity coming to you about what topics we've chosen for next week. Monday will be a recap, further developments, and so forth on today and what's happened. And also, I think we've titled Monday, What the Heck Do We Do Now? So we will get into greater detail, start to do more deep dives from Monday onwards about the practical things that businesses need to put in place. For the moment, for those of us in New South Wales, step 1 has not even started yet, but good opportunity for us to be preparing for all 3 steps and having a really good plan and guidelines and communications in place. If you have specific questions about your business or you want us to help you out, contact us anytime. As I said, our details are in the chat screen, and you can find us and communicate with us in a whole range of different ways. On Monday, I will be looking at further developments and clarifications regarding this framework that I've outlined for easing restrictions and discussing what the heck do we do now. So please join us, invite your friends and colleagues to join us. We'd love to have you. These live streams are being recorded. They're available afterwards in our Facebook page, on our YouTube channel, in LinkedIn, and you can also find a whole heap of targeted information available on our website. So in the meantime, before I see you all again on Monday morning for our scheduled live stream, please hug the people that you can, wave cheerily at those that you can't at the moment. Stay safe, stay home, wash your hands, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Monday. Thank you so much.